All right, so Chapter 10, Property, Plant, and Equipment. The acquisition and disposition of property, plant, and equipment. So when you talk about property, plant, and equipment, we're talking about a whole plethora of different items. This is what we're going to focus on today. We're talking about the acquisition costs that go into land improvements, buildings, equipment, and we're going to talk about how interest costs fit into that equation. So we're going to figure out how to value our purchases. We're going to talk about what happens when you incur costs subsequent to acquisition and ultimately when you dispose of your fixed assets. Okay? So we're going to start off with land. And can anyone tell me, when you're talking about land, do we also talk about depreciation? No. Land is a fixed asset, but it does not depreciate. So it's generally classified as property, plant, and equipment, but it does not depreciate. Okay? So here, it's important when I say it's generally classified as property, plant, and equipment. This is land that you're using in operations, okay? So not land that you're holding for some other purpose to sell or something like that. It's not an investment. Here we're talking about it as property, plant, and equipment. Okay? So costs include, there's a whole list of things here, and what I just want to kind of, before we get into like this whole ridiculous list, what happens is when you purchase a property, and this is going to sort of help us through the lesson. When you purchase a property, you have a closing statement, okay? And on that closing statement, you have all sorts of fees, okay? You have, the attorney will put their fee on this closing statement. The purchase price will be on there. Any recording fees, title fees, commissions for brokers and things. Sometimes you buy a property and you buy it on the 15th of the month, and there were taxes due on the 30th, but you only owe it for 15 days. So the amount of taxes are, that you will owe related to the property, or that the seller owes you, because you're going to have to pay the full taxes at the end of the month. That's all factored into the sale. Okay. So this happens whether or not you buy a commercial property or a residential property. All right. I've seen this a lot with commercial properties. So it's basically one big journal entry. What's the purchase price? And it figures down, and you have all these different fees broken down, and what the buyer owes and what the seller owes, and essentially you have to record this as a journal entry on your books. Okay? So what happens is all of these fees become part of the purchase price. Okay? This becomes part of what you would record the land at. So there's often building, not just land, and we'll get into that allocation in a little while, but essentially when you buy property, you have lots of fees that you pay along with it. Those fees are going to be included in the price of that property. Now, other things that get the property ready for its intended purpose are also going to be included in the cost of that land. So I'm talking first broadly. You buy a property, you have lots of fees that are on that closing statement. That's all going to be recorded. It's one big closing statement, if you ever work in real estate, is one big journal entry. You have to make that journal entry. You're going to record it all you have to allocate between land and building, and we're going to, like I said, we'll talk about that later. But there's also other things that will happen. For example, to get land ready for its intended use, you may have to remove an old building. Okay? That also would go into the cost of the land. Okay? So anything to get that land ready for its intended use. I have here draining, filling, clearing. Okay? So you have the fees, and then you have these other costs to get it ready for its intended use. Okay? And that's all going to be incorporated into the price. Yes? Yes, exactly. I was going to say a HUD form, but I didn't think anyone would really know what that is. But yeah, HUD 1 form. You're really talking. This is the closing statement. Okay. So there are a couple of other things we need to incorporate here when you talk about land. Sometimes what happens is you have proceeds from these salvage materials. So I can tell you, some people buy property. Okay. And they buy it for the stuff that's inside. Like some people sell property and it has, like copper piping. You ever hear like people stealing copper piping and things like that? You're like, who wants that? Why would you do that? There's value a lot of times in things that that the seller may not, may either incorporate into the price or not, but the buyer may buy that property knowing that there's value in these salvage materials. Okay, so they might buy a property, a buyer might buy a property and be able to sell materials that are inside that that property. So the proceeds from that sale will reduce the price of the land. Okay, if there are salvage materials. Okay, so there are things that add to it and there are things that reduce the price. If you make permanent improvements to the land, then those are also going to add to the price of what the value of the land is that you were going to record it at. So if you have, if you add sewers or drainage that the government requires that you add upon purchase, okay, you can add that to the price of your land. If you have some kind of permanent landscaping that you put in that doesn't have a useful life, that would also add to the price of your land. Separately from that, you may have things like land improvements. We're going to do a quick brief exercise, but I just want to mention. So sometimes you may add a driveway, for example, to the land. A driveway has a useful life. At some point, that driveway may need to be repaved. Okay, so driveways, whereas they look like they're maybe, is that really part of my land? There are some things that you add to land that have limited lives. Those things are called land improvements, and they do depreciate. Okay, so the difference, you add things to land that do not have a useful life. If there's some improvement that you make to your land that actually does have a limited life, you have to put that as a land improvement and depreciate it accordingly. Okay, so it depends upon the type of improvement that you're referring to. Okay, so just to start off, very basic, look at brief exercise 10.1. It's a very, very brief exercise. So we're looking at what goes into the price of land. Brief exercise 10.1. (10-1), brief exercise 10-1. Okay. We also have things like land improvements. I gave you driveways as an example. Fences might be very commonly put up. These would generally be classified as land improvements because they have useful lives that are not indefinite. Okay, they will depreciate over time and have to be replaced at some point. Okay, so these would be recorded as capital. They would be recorded, as some kind of capital asset, okay, as property, plant, and equipment. However, they wouldn't be recorded in the land account because they have useful lives. Land does not depreciate. Okay.